Afternoon. Wow. Yeah, we don't draw as much attention as maybe a press conference on BBB, but let me thank all of you for assembling. Let me thank my colleagues for being here. We're here to talk about the child care and pre-K proposal that's in the Build Back Better proposal. A proposal that, at least on the child care and pre-K, had no hearings, had no debate, had no consultation with the states, no consultation with providers. And what we'd like to do is lay out for you what the cost is to the American taxpayer. This is a plan that total cost, Democrats say, is $1.75 trillion. CBO's new number scoring the plan as everything extending for the full 10 years is a number of $4.9 trillion. In the child care and universal pre-K space, the plan suggests that it's $381 billion. The score from CBO, if those plans all exist for 10 years, is $752 billion. And that's making an assumption that 34% of eligible young children live in states that won't participate in the child care piece, and 40% of eligible preschoolers live in states that won't participate in a pre-K plan. So to quote a liberal analyst, and I quote, excluding kids in Texas, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, and the Carolinas and other similar states from universal pre-K and child care subsidies is an intentional strategy to keep costs down. If the CBO had not factored non-participation in their estimates, then the reported costs for the last 3 years of these programs would have been at least 50% higher. That's over and above the $752 billion that CBO projected. The Progressive People's Policy Project estimates that unsubsidized middle-class families will face inflation cost increasing child care by the tune of $13,000 per year. So take the current child care cost and add $13,000 additional dollars to the cost of child care for one student on an annual basis that's not being subsidized. Democrat plan intentionally shrinks the supply of providers by killing off faith-based providers, small family child care homes, kinship care. So not only do we have a skyrocketing cost of $13,000 in additional cost for child care, we're also reducing the supply of child care that exists in the country. The preschool program grows over time to require a state to invest 37% match, all on state taxpayers. The Democrats end the funding for their child care and pre-K programs in just 6 years. In Washington, we may get away with things like this. Across the country, parents are looking to plan their lives. They need the predictability of child care, and it's impossible to build in when, in fact, you put out a plan that says we're going to subsidize it for 6 years. Listen, we're all realists, and what I've asked my colleagues to do is share with you approaches to bring affordable child care to everybody in America, but also to talk about their experiences in their states, what they're faced with, more importantly, what parents in their state are faced with, because ultimately, whether it's the federal taxpayer or the state taxpayer or the family that pays $13,000 more per child, this is all parents across the country, and they're the ones that are facing the rising cost of inflation today. This is putting it on steroids. With that, I'd like to call on Tim Scott to come up.
Thank you, Senator Burr, for leading this important press conference on an issue that is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It is simply an American issue. Imagine, if you will, households across the country, specifically those households in South Carolina, the one like I grew up in when I was a kid. Single-parent household, waking up to the sense of desperation because your gas prices are up nearly 75%. So instead of spending less than $2 a gallon in 2020, you're now spending over $3.30 a gallon in 2021. Imagine, if you will, turning your heat up or likely turning your heat down to conserve money because your utilities are up 25%. And then you wake up to the BBB, as I call it, the Build Back Broker Plan, and you realize that the bone-crushing, life-changing, hope-stealing, job-killing aspects of the BBB includes increasing your child care costs, as Senator Burr said, by $13,000. But to understand the actual impact of that $13,000, you have to first understand that the current cost is over $15,000. So said in a way that everybody in our nation can understand, with median income around $34,000, you take taxes out, the cost of child care is now more than your take-home pay. Literally providing child care for one kid is more than the take-home pay of the average income in our nation. And somehow we are to celebrate this notion that the government is here to do something for you, when in fact, you know the government is taking something from you. And what are they taking? Your hope, your future, your plans. And so while we may think of this as a exercise of political philosophy, one side versus the other, we may think of this as a red versus a blue. This is literally an attempt to fundamentally transform what it means to take care of your child in the place you want to send your child by eliminating options, increasing the cost, and stealing the hope from far too many families who deserve better from their government.
Right now, our parents and our families in Iowa and all across the country are facing higher prices. Everything from gasoline to groceries, they are seeing the highest inflation in a generation now. Costs are up. The families are struggling out there. And what do the Democrats want to do? They want to force through this tax and spend plan, what they call Build Back Better. But what does that do? Within the plan, it nearly doubles the cost of child care. And this is what the tax and spending spree would do. Of course, with doubling the cost of child care, as been stated before, families in Iowa, we're already what we consider a child care desert. I know when I had my sweet baby Libby, all those years ago, I struggled in my little hometown to find child care. And because they're going to increase the cost of child care and restrict who can have access to federal funds and subsidies, we will lose many daycare providers and the opportunity to have a child in a stable learning environment and care. So it's critical. What we've also seen, too, is that when you lose access to child care and the cost nearly doubling in this plan, for those that are unsubsidized and sending their child to daycare, there will have to be a significant choice at that point. One parent may decide to stay home because they can no longer afford child care. And we know that most oftentimes that's going to be the mother. And already through COVID, we've seen many, many women exit the workforce because their child wasn't in school. Well, what does this do to that woman's future? The potential earnings decrease, the stability and opportunity to advance in their careers decreases. So it's not just the children that are impacted, but the family as a whole. So again, if the Democrats want to proceed down this path and push through their BBB, or what we call the reckless tax and spend bill, parents are going to have fewer options for child care. and the cost of childcare for those middle-income families will soar. We cannot afford to do this, and we're placing the burden of this on the backs of our hardworking families.
Thank you, Johnny. Matt?
Thank you, Senator Burr. You heard some concerns about the child care plan, which is part of the BBB, and you might ask yourself, why is it that it's got all these problems? And I'm going to talk about the process. The question is the right way to write legislation having a few people in one party only sit down and write something themselves without any input from the other party, without hearings, without the back and forth between the two houses with Republicans and Democrats working together? Is that the right way to get a piece of legislation done, which affects, in this case, a pretty darn important thing, our children and raising our kids? Now, we've looked at what the Democrats have put together by themselves and have pointed out some of the flaws in it, some real problems. But the heart of the problem is that they haven't been willing to work on a bipartisan basis to see if we couldn't come up with something better, something that would be acceptable to both parties, such that if down the road the Republican Party happens to be in charge, we might not just throw what they have out and move to an entirely different program. Now, you might say, Republicans don't care about this. Actually, we do. You may not have noticed, but early on, it's up there. Somehow it appeared. Early on, I put out a plan that was able to provide monthly checks for each child, and up to 5 children per household. It was entirely paid for. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but this is designed not to say that it's necessarily better than the Biden plan. I think it is, but you may not agree. But the idea is we care about this issue and are willing to work with Democrats to find common ground and to create something that works with public input, with hearings, with bipartisanship. The reason BBB does not make sense, one reason it does not make sense, not just because it's a bad piece of legislation, but because it hasn't been worked together on a collaborative basis to work for the American people, to represent not just a few people, but to represent all the people of our country. And I hope that our Democrat friends take that into account. I'm working with a couple of Democrats saying, hey, let's work together. Let's work together on caring for our kids. I think we can do that, and I hope that we're able to do that next year. Thank you. Sorry for covering up this beautiful.
It is truly incredible that the House-passed version of BBB would result in child care that is more expensive and less accessible. Chairman Burr has already, you're still chairman to me, has already talked about the fact that studies have shown that the new mandates that would be imposed would increase the cost of child care by $13,000, making it unaffordable. But there are also problems with the bill and its new mandates that would decrease access to child care. Let me tell you about Chrissy, who has been providing child care in rural Maine in Somerset County for 21 years. When she heard about all of the new mandates that she would have to meet under the BBB bill, she told me there is no way that my child care based in my home could possibly survive. In addition, we have heard from faith-based organizations who have said that the new requirements would force them to close their doors in many cases. And that is critical because approximately half of all child care slots are provided by faith-based organizations. So that's why we would have a severe access problem. There's another issue which Mitt Romney just touched on, and that is we have an existing program that is the Child Care Development Block Grant Program. It is a bipartisan program. It has existed for years. The last time it was reauthorized in 2014, it passed with 88 votes. Before that, it was authorized with more than 90 votes. So why aren't we taking a program that has worked well, that already exists, and expand its funding so that we can help more families, but keep the rules the same so that we do not create these tremendous accessibility and affordability problems? That's the answer, to take the existing program, put more funding in it, but keep the structure the same. It's worked well, it's been bipartisan, and it's served families across America.
Jonathan.
Well, thanks, Richard. My colleagues have said it really well, but fewer options and higher costs. That's what you're going to get with the Democrats' toddler takeover. This assumption that Washington knows best about everything, and that the best thing that the American people and parents and families can do is just shift and consolidate and centralize power and control in Washington, D.C., because Washington knows best. That's the approach the Democrats are taking with this partisan spending bill, which is overhauling programs that have enjoyed bipartisan support in the past, and for which there are much better solutions that reflect the views of parents across this country and take into consideration what state and local governments are doing in terms of their decisions about child care in this country. But instead, the Washington Democrats have this, we'll just take everything, all the power, all the control, all the decisions about who's eligible, about what the quality of care will be in some of these places. All those decisions now would go and move to Washington, D.C. That, ladies and gentlemen, is just flat wrong. And Senator Collins pointed out, this is a liberal-leaning think tank which says that the average cost per child could go up $13,000. I mean, think about that. This is supposed to be helping American families, particularly middle-income families, working families, and all this is going to do is drive up their cost and give them fewer options. 53% of the families in this country get their child care through a faith-based center, and what this particular proposal would do is discriminate entirely against those types of child care centers that provide meaningful care for so many parents who send their kids there for various reasons. It might be the quality of care. It might be just the instruction that they receive. But there are so many reasons why parents in this country have the choice and should continue to have the choice and the option to send their kids where they want to send their kids, and to not have Washington stepping on the scales and determining what the options are going to be. And what's worse for the American family, dramatically driving up the cost. This is a really bad idea, and there is a much better approach and a much better way, but you don't get that, as Senator Romney pointed out, when you have one party with a partisan process trying to exercise total control over the American people's lives. I hope we can stop this, along with a lot of other really bad ideas in this legislation.
Marcia?
I think you're getting the idea that we think this is a really bad idea. And as a grandmother of a 15-month-old, I can tell you it is such a bad idea. You know, in Tennessee, it's so interesting. This time of year, we're having church bazaars and Christmas programs and a lot of community events. And every single place I go, I have somebody who says, hey, is it really true that the federal government wants to take over child care? And the reason they're talking about this so much is quite simply, in Tennessee, the primary source of Mother's Day Out programs, of daycare programs, of after-school programs is your local church. And that's where these are taking place. And that is where children are coming during the week.
And many times it is a bunch of grandmamas in the community that want to come love on these kids and help take care of these kids, and likewise help educate these young moms about how to care for children. And what the federal government would do is would strip these grandmamas of a job that they are doing and they're loving doing. And it would strip these children of caregivers that are there to love and nurture them. That's a real loss, and it has a real cost. Now, what the Democrats are trying to do in their BBB, I call it the Bill Back Broke, what they're trying to do is take one vote. And in this one vote, they want to take government control of your children, of education, of your small business, of your bank account. It's their socialist agenda, 24/7, daylight to dark, cradle to grave. That is their goal. But who is going to be most adversely impacted by the bad decision making of the Democratic Party? It is going to be children. It is going to be working parents who are going to be stripped of an opportunity to use child care right there in their local community that is being provided by their neighbors and friends that they trust.
Richard, thanks for organizing this. As Marcia said, you're kind of getting a common theme here, but I think there are two takeaways that we want to be sure you all get. There's the cost point. The estimates, including from many left-to-center think tanks, about $13,000 increase per kid for a lot of middle-class families is pretty amazing to behold. This is just a breathtakingly dumb construction of a program. Think of the most bureaucratic, antiseptic, built for secularized bureaucracy in Washington programs you can think of. The BBB comes along and says, hold my beer. We can do something a lot stupider than that. 53% of American families who use institutional child care use religious child care. There are a lot of problems in America. Joe Biden ran to tackle a whole bunch of problems. Religious daycare wasn't one of the problems that the American people were saying, dang it, top 10 list of American problems. Let's make sure we bankrupt all religious daycare. Just breathtakingly stupid. When I listen to Nebraska families, and again, there will be people across the political continuum from right to center left to left that will think the government should fund more or less of these things. I've never once heard a Nebraska family say, the thing I really want is to make sure that religious daycare is made bankrupt. Could you please send people to Washington and bankrupt religious daycare? And I'd be really surprised if the voters and citizens of Nevada or Arizona or West Virginia or New Hampshire said, you know what I want my senator to do? Go to D.C. and bankrupt religious daycare. Honestly, there's so much political news that's written for political news junkies in D.C. Think about all the TikTok of who has indigestion and who talked to who yesterday and who Chuck Schumer called on his flip phone. There's all this process stuff about who might have, shown the entrails when they were, cleaning a deer, and they might have changed their view about how they might vote on something on Christmas Eve. But at a basic policy level, the vast majority of the American people aren't paying attention to the entrails of this bill. And hopefully it's up to you all to make sure they see into the underbelly of this bill. Because I don't think there is any outcry in any of our states for Washington to, on Christmas Eve, come in and say, we'd like to take away your religious daycare, because this bill does that.
I want to thank all of you. Obviously, the cost and lack of choice is the main issue here. But I think we all agree the main issue are these children and their families. And how are they going to manage child care for their children? How are they going to manage to get back to work? What's most effective in rural and urban America? And it's almost like Ben said, there's a system out there that can be improved upon, as Susan said as well. So it's not like we're trying to fix a broken system. So I want to thank Richard Burr for really highlighting this issue, because it's been kind of hidden. And there shouldn't be anything hidden about child care for our children. Now, I have 7 grandchildren, and I know Mitt Romney has at least 3 times more than that, maybe 4. Maybe 4 times more than that. But of the 7, 6 of them have been in faith-based daycare. My children were in faith-based daycare when they were younger. It's a system that's local, that works. It has quality education, has standards, and it works in conjunction with other private and public offerings of child care. I just talked with 6 actual faith-based daycares in our state that have been in operation probably collectively for at least 100 years. And one of them said it's already more difficult to find staff. This bill would escalate that and make it much more difficult. If non-faith-based care is being subsidized, it will lower overhead for non-faith-based institutions, and it would put them at a continued competitive advantage over faith-based. There's also a requirement in there that you have to provide transportation to these. Think about that. Instead of going to the church that's maybe in your small community that's been offering daycare for years, you're now going to put your 3-year-old on a bus, and in West Virginia, you can be on a bus for an hour to get to your public school. I mean, that to me is eliminating choice for our parents. I'd like to thank Tanya Neal from Tays Valley Christian Daycare. She said, and it was a great quote, "Where the money comes, so does the control." And I think that's what you see. As many as have said, the control is wanting to be in Washington by the Democrats in this bill, and that's what the structure that they've put together. So I thank you for highlighting a great topic. This is very important, and I think not enough people are talking about it, but it's going to impact a lot of families all across this country. Thank you.
Nice to see you can tease out a little humor in a kind of a dreary subject, but when you look at what's happened in the time that I've been here, which is a little under 3 years, look at the larger context. We were $18 trillion in debt when I got here. We're now nearly $30 trillion. With the American Family Rescue Plan, sounds great. Build Back Better sounds great. We're on a sugar high of government spending and really changing the dynamic of this country. And this is just one small part of it. You've heard the particulars on just child care. The bill's loaded with other stuff like that. And the other side of the aisle, they're political enterprisers. They do seize the moment. But the shameful part about this is the CBO just took the real score on when you do something like this, and it's closer to $3 trillion of additional debt, not $360 billion. Of course, we throw trillions around now like we used to, billions. But the shameful part of it is child care. We're asking our children and our grandkids to pay the bill. And if you want to take away from what you're hearing here today, this is one small part of it. That story does not end well when you extend it into the future. And to me, when you're trying to help our kids and grandkids and you ask them to pay for it, that's a bridge too far, and that's where we're at.
John?
Well, you would think when it comes to something like child care, the people advocating for the so-called BBB would want to make things better, not make them worse. Yet they have accomplished exactly that, made it actually worse, not better. You've heard about the reduced access and the increased cost. And of course, as working moms, when they can't find affordable child care, means they're not part of the labor force. And if there's one thing I hear from Texas employers, it's they can't find enough good people to perform the good, well-paying jobs that exist in this economy. And then there's the whole issue of inflation across the board, not just inflation when it comes to child care costs, but inflation for literally everything from your gas to the food that you put on the table. Of course, these higher costs mean less choices for working families in Texas and elsewhere. And finally, let me just say that we're beginning to peel back some of the mystery of the Build Back Better or Build Back Broke bill when it comes to the actual score. The original score of $1.75 trillion was full of cliffs, stops, starts, and frankly, just a lot of budget gimmicks. now that we know that if temporary programs like this one were passed and were continued as they are likely to be here in Washington, a temporary government program, as Ronald Reagan said, is the closest thing to eternal life here in Washington, it would literally be $5 trillion. So the bottom line is we can't afford it, and we don't need it, and we need to kill it.
So working Americans should be able to afford a working American lifestyle. For years, we've seen members of the middle class experience modestly increasing or even stagnant wages and the cost of things that we all depend on, from housing to child care, have been ticking upward. In the great state of Indiana, we join roughly a third of the rest of America in finding that child care costs actually exceed the cost of higher education. So this issue has not received enough attention. The worst thing we could do is to put out of business our existing child care providers, which is precisely what the Build Back Better plan would do. It would impose undue additional costs and requirements on our faith-based providers, your YMCAs, your church-based providers. This would be highly unpopular with Hoosier families and families across this country, and be really expensive, too. If you're increasing demand at a time that you're decreasing supply, of course, your prices of care are going to go up. So this is yet another half-baked scheme, and it's demonstrative, it's illustrative of the fact that the National Democratic Party is out of touch with not just the challenges people are facing, but also their desired solutions. They like their local community-based providers. If they don't want to go to a faith-based provider, they'll find another provider. So we need smart solutions to be able to address this. Some of my colleagues have alluded to their ideas. I have my own ideas to certify child care providers, bring more workers into the child care field, which is the main driver of our child care costs. So, the Democrats need to work with us. They need to remember that we played them to a tie in the Senate, we picked up seats in the House of Representatives, and we have a Democratic president. Instead, they are focused on pressing forward with one piece of legislation to try and bundle together 30 years' worth of far-left priorities. And the American people are not warm to this idea. So let's actually solve the problems. Let's start by killing the toddler tax, the toddler takeover that the Democrats propose in this legislation. Let's repeal Build Back Better. Let's come together and solve these working-class challenges.
Todd, thank you very much. I might add, it was 20 years ago when Barbara Mikulski and I got together and worked on the CDBG, that existing program that funds child care. And I'll leave you with these words because I think my colleagues have summed it up extremely well. Difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has limits. Albert Einstein. Think about that. Thank you very much.
Senator, can I just ask you quickly, sorry, just off topic really quickly. Crime, the rising crime happening across, major cities in America. Your thoughts on calling for a full hearing? Talk about that.
Well, I'm not on judiciary any longer, but I do think that there needs to be a hearing on it. I do think that there should be a hearing on that and understanding why we're seeing the rash of crimes across the United States, and then ways that we can assist with our local governments, our state governments, and through the federal government, find partnerships to make this better.
On topic.
Can I on topic, this is an opt-in program, and states, if they do opt-in, can't take any more than 10% of their block grant funding for children under 6 anymore. And I was wondering if you guys have talked to different states about whether they would even participate in this plan if Democrats are able to get it passed.
Take a look at the states that chose not to expand Medicaid, and I think you get a pretty good indication as to how the map lays and probably what CBO followed from a standpoint of how they scored it.
Senator, related to the cost of raising children, the child tax credit expires at the end of this month. Is there an appetite at all in the Republican conference for renewing that, extending that in any capacity before the end of the year?
Right now, there's not an appetite in the Republican conference to engage in anything. We haven't been included in any of the discussions, debates, or consideration of this legislation.
And if I can add on to that, though, as well. Yes, I'm sorry. And I would love to add on to that, too. So this was a program that was put into place through one of the COVID relief packages. So now Democrats are really concerned about continuing on this program. What do we think is going to happen if the programs in the BBB are put into place, programs that are only funded 3 years, 5 years? We've already said as Republicans that once you have a program in place and you're providing those subsidies, you've expanded that access, it is really hard to then stop the program. So this illustrates completely and perfectly what we see happening with all of the socialized welfare programs that we see in the Build Back Better bill. They will continue forever because Congress won't have the will to end those programs, even though the Democrats have stated they'll only last so many years or we'll find a way to pay for them. We haven't found a way to pay for them, or they would have demonstrated them.
Forget all the process and politics. Do either of you vote want the expanded tax credit to continue in 2022?
They'd have to find a way to pay for it, and they haven't discussed that with us.
Senator Romney mentioned some of the process concerns about the reconciliation bill. I know that you guys share a lot of those. Senator Manchin has been in negotiations with the White House. So has he made any comments to you guys, or have you heard anything from him about process concerns with how?
Well, I think you heard his colleague from West Virginia raise concerns about faith-based organizations. Those are the same faith-based organizations that Senator Manchin represents.
Yeah, God bless him. He's got a lot on his shoulders.
Last one.
HHS said they may need more COVID money, which means they may have to come back to Congress to ask for more money to battle COVID.
I can tell you, I talk to the agencies practically every day. Nobody has asked for more money. They're flush with money right now. Thanks.
Thank you.